Just a question about recommendation 10, which is the state should advocate for a shift in emphasis in EU and international economic policy away from GDP expansion as a goal in itself and towards the goal of societal and ecological well-being. I think it's a great recommendation, but I think it's a recommendation which is quite radical because it goes against the grain of kind of the ideology of growth and growthism, which arises, I think, from this capitalist system that we live in, production for profit, need for constantly expansion in order to keep profit going. But I wonder just how did you come upon this? Because it cuts against the assumption across mainstream media, the assumption, I would say, in the civil service, the assumption in the vast majority of political parties, that kind of by definition, GDP going up is a good thing. Our lives will get better if we have more GDP. Our lives will get worse if we have less GDP, as opposed to looking at what constitutes that GDP. Is that things, you have stuff that adds to GDP that makes people's lives worse rather than better. Arms production, advertising, fossil fuel production. And there's lots of things, obviously, that add very little to GDP, but actually make people's lives better in terms of public luxury, high-quality parks, those things. They add something, but they don't add anything near what they add. So just your kind of considerations around that would be interesting, and how much that you considered that.
So the resourcing of the state's response to biodiversity loss was a key focus of members directly from meeting 1. And so in our second meeting in September, we had Dr. Eddie Casey, who's Chief Economist with the Irish Fiscal Advisory Council. He addressed the Assembly, and we also had Professor Kate Rayworth, who's creator of the Donut Economics Action Lab, also addressed the Assembly. And with that, we were trying, again, to ensure that we had diversity of perspectives. But what members really latched onto in recommendation 10 that you highlighted there, Deputy Murphy, was our international responsibilities, and that if we are only focusing on growth for ourselves as an economy, as you said, it's not necessarily to the betterment of everybody or to the betterment of the rest of the world. And to support those, we have recommendations 33 and 34, and that's where members wanted to the state to fully embrace the beyond GDP concept and ensure that the national well-being framework was something that was at the core of economic decisions, so that the national well-being framework is something that actually encompasses environment, climate and biodiversity, and that be the focus rather than simply the number of GDP, which can be often skewed, as we've seen. And this was something that, again, can be seen as quite progressive of members. And in one way, I often think citizens' assemblies in Ireland provide this unusual voice to members of society to come forward, which is often ahead of the thinking of, no offence to our policymakers and our politicians. Again, potentially something surprising to see there, but in the grand scheme of all the presentations that we were given, where we were told that by us buying products from South America, by even having chocolate and coffee, we are impacting on biodiversity of other places. And that if we actually buy local, buy seasonal, buy organic, support our Irish farmers, we're helping international biodiversity. That then fed into the conversations of, well, in this economy, how can we be doing better? And that was the idea that we don't go beyond our boundaries, we don't go beyond our means, we don't push the planet beyond what it can actually provide for us. And that's what you see in those recommendations 10, 33 and 34.
Thanks a lot. Kind of related, and it relates to a point that Micheál was making earlier about, all these plans to expand agricultural production in Ireland. So you have Harvest 2020, which was a 10-year plan for 50% growth in dairy and pig meat production, 20% growth in beef and sheep production, 10% increase in poultry production. I mean, there was no way that was ever going to be compatible with not deepening our biodiversity crisis, was there? So a question as to whether you think that, has the Department of Agriculture thinking changed on any of this in the intervening time? Do they accept, it's a recommendation to say that all governmental departments must explicitly acknowledge the state's declaration and take immediate and targeted action? Obviously, if we were to have another plan like that, it would run directly against what you're appealing to, what you're calling for to happen here.
I can have a go at answering that, but I think maybe James obviously could come in as well, because he engages with the department more regularly probably than I do. And I suppose the answer is not enough. I mean, in the sense that if you look at the entire report and you look at the critique it's making of the way the state approaches nature, and agriculture is a large component in terms of 70% of land use, you'd have to say that the evidence is in front of us and that we have still got a significant problem. But on the other hand, there was a lot of data presented showing, let's say, a sense of a need for a shift. So that's what I mean by not enough. And the response I made to an earlier conversation, and several others have said it too, which is, how do you tackle the problem in the future? The process needs to be a different process where data is put on the table and there is time and space and transparency to really kick the tires in terms of new policy. In a situation like that, then agriculture policy then becomes part of a broader conversation around sustainability and integrated approach to government. That's what's needed. Do we have that yet fully? Not yet. Thanks, James.
If I can, I'll just come in before James, if that's okay. What you have stated there, Deputy Murphy, I think is reflected in recommendation 16 and also recommendation 75. So 16 says that Ireland should work with all stakeholders to review the current food policy in the context of the biodiversity crisis, particularly in agriculture and marine sectors, to balance between the affordability and quality of food. What we heard informally from many presenters was that the EU's food policy was a cheap food policy to ensure that the EU could provide for the EU. And in that, what we heard from certain farmers was that, well, that actually drove them to not have crop rotation, to use more machinery, to try and get as much out for as little as possible, but not necessarily focusing on the quality of food. And that's why at the end of this recommendation 16, that the members said that, well, it's not necessarily that we can get rid of cheap food, because we need all members of society to have access to high quality food. And with that, we might consider the vulnerable sections of the population that require that access, and some big thinking needs to happen with that. But really, and kind of to echo what Micheál has just said there, that our food production should be in line with all of the commitments that we have signed up to, which is Agenda 2030, the Sustainable Development Goals that everyone's talking about right now, the Paris Agreement, which is our climate agreements, and the EU Green Deal, and our current legal obligations to protect biodiversity, genetic resources and water quality. And we are not doing that. So it's really to have now an action where we see that our food policies and our agricultural policies align with those other commitments that we have made.
Yeah. I suppose these overarching policies, the Food Harvest 2020 and the Food Vision 2030, we must remember the point of time when Food Harvest was done. We were just at the point of the economic crash at the time. The country was on its knees. It was looking to some indigenous industry within Ireland that could grow us out of the economic catastrophe that we were in at the time, and it looked to agriculture, and that's why you saw an overriding emphasis on production growth. They knew the writing was on the wall at the time that the dairy quotas were going to go and be lifted in 2013, which left a huge possibility for expansion. This was an industry-led policy, so the industry were always going to actually look to seize that opportunity at the time, and that's what it did. There is some talk within that it should have been more of an encompassing sustainability thing, but the economic trumped everything else there. It was like a heavy weight on top of society and the environment in terms of the consequences. The consequences were predicted by the EPA and the environmental assessments of that, but at the time it was, we're in such economic tide, drive on, and this is where we're at with the Nitrates Directive this week, it is the consequences of that. Some of that language in terms of policy was moderated in the Food Vision 2030. If you look at the language of the missions and goals of Food Vision 2030, you couldn't. They are the sustainability all over them. It's meeting the Sustainable Development Goals. It looks very good, but I think it was Deputy O'Rourke alluded to some of the stakeholders leaving the building in terms of when that was being finalised. I think a lot of that was down to the actual how that was going to be implementation and the details around the Food Vision 2030. I think it fundamentally comes down now. I think the industry has a key role to this. We need industry. We've one of the best food industries and potential globally. We're leaders in this, but these food visions and our food systems in general is too important for it just to be overly, not controlled, but we'll say influenced and a role by the industry. They're hugely important, but I think we need a wider food systems approach to our next food vision, and that needs to take a society-led approach. Not we've prided us industry-led. The Department of Agriculture, the Minister would say this, the government would say this is industry-led, which put an overriding emphasis on that sector of society. But the economy, a functioning economy, serves the needs of society and works within the environmental limits. We've got it the other way around. So what we need to do is have the space in the middle, society leading this, cognizant of our environmental limits in terms of the donut economics, but also serving the economy, serving these needs. So we must have a functioning economy, a functioning agri-industry. We have huge potential there for a wonderful food sector, which to a certain extent we have in terms of global leading, but it having an overriding influence as a food vision. Mission goals, perfect, you know, but I think we need to just maybe take them missions and goals and look at the implementation more clearly. I think more of a societal influence on that and support from consumers as well as the production side will lead us with a much better policy. That needs to be done now urgently, because the actual Common Agricultural Policy, the next round, post-2027, the decisions are being made on that and how that's going to emerge in 2025 and 2026. We need to have our conversation on our food vision to 2050, a whole of society in the next 24 months to actually influence what's going to happen in the implementation on the ground in 2028. Thanks.